Former U.S. President Jimmy Carter died on December 29, 2024, at the impressive age of 100. Now that some time has passed since his death, it is no longer too soon to talk about him critically. Let's reflect on his presidency and legacy in the context of empire. In recent years, Carter has made headlines for his opposition to what he called Israeli apartheid. He authored a book on the subject, which is pretty unusual for former US presidents, who are usually too busy writing inspirational or self-help style memoirs.
The word apartheid is exactly accurate. You know, this is an area that's occupied by two powers. They're now completely separated. The Palestinians can't even ride on the same roads that the Israelis have created or built in Palestinian territory. The Israelis never see a Palestinian except their Israeli soldiers. The Palestinians never see an Israeli except at a distance, except the Israeli soldiers. So within Palestinian territory, they're absolutely and totally separated, much worse than they were in South Africa, by the way. And the other thing is, the other definition of apartheid is one side dominates the other. And the Israelis completely dominate the life of the Palestinian people.
Why don't Americans know what you have seen?
Americans don't want to know.
But his personal convictions, which he only came to late in life and once he was out of public office, should not be extended to his administration and political career. Carter's policies fit within the broader ethos of the empire. Just look at the way CNN hails Carter's foreign policy as more successful than he gets credit for. Indeed, Carter was successful in branding American imperialism through the discourse of human rights. Carter became president in 1977. The long and unpopular war on Vietnam had ended 2 years earlier. Carter then branded the U.S., especially the Democratic Party, into a benevolent policeman that advocated for human rights globally. Carter made his human rights cause explicit in his 1977 inaugural address.
We are a proudly idealistic nation, but let no one confuse our idealism with weakness. Because we are free, we can never be indifferent to the fate of freedom elsewhere. Our moral sense dictates a clear-cut preference for those societies which share with us an abiding respect for individual human rights.
According to the State Department, during the early weeks of the administration, officials condemned the alleged human rights violations in Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, and Uganda. However, the Carter administration took an inconsistent approach to human rights. He mostly focused on the human rights abuses, alleged or real, of the U.S. enemies. The Secretary of State at the time, Cyrus Vance, explained that the administration would not comment on each and every issue, but would comment when we see a threat to human rights, and when it was constructive to do so. And we all know what this really means. We will only speak about human rights when convenient for our political interests. The Carter administration did from time to time try to push allies to do better on human rights. For example, in 1977, the Carter administration reduced military aid to his Cold War ally Argentina because of charges that the military government had killed political opponents.
¿Qué pasa, señora?
Queremos nuestros hijos, que nos digan dónde están, por lo menos. Mi hijo hoy hace 15 meses. ¿Dónde están los bebés?
¿Por qué no nos dicen a nosotros si están vivos, si están muertos? ¿Por qué no nos dicen? Si le buscamos eso nada más, que nos respondan nada más, después nos retiramos.
Allanaron 4 veces mi casa, me llevaron y me torturaron para que dijera dónde estaba mi hijo. Esa es la Argentina que tenemos.
Queremos todos, no los queremos a uno, a mi hijo. Yo quiero a todos los hijos de todas las mujeres.
¿Cuántos son ustedes?
Miles
de mujeres,
miles en todo el país, miles.
The mainstream media, which generally acted as a mouthpiece of the U.S. government, especially on foreign policy, echoed the Carter administration's pressure on some allies. One really interesting example from the archives is when the Washington Post in January of 1978 inquired with Iran. At the time, Iran was still ruled by the US ally, the Shah. He was inquired as to whether the allegations of human rights abuses in Iran were true. The Washington Post wrote the Iranian embassy in DC to ask about Ghulam Hossein Saedi, a novelist and cultural critic who was imprisoned by the Shah's government, allegedly tortured, and coerced into recanting his politics on live television. The Iranian representative responded that Saedi was tried and convicted for his communism. After he was released, he voluntarily appeared on a television and radio program in which he repudiated his communist teachings. I think you would want to be aware that the use of torture is outlawed in my country, and anyone using it against a prisoner or any other person is subject to a stringent prosecution. The Washington Post simply followed up with, "You were good to give the matter prompt attention." This was despite the inaccuracies in the statement of the Iranian embassy. The inconsistent approach to human rights, depending on who is a friend and who is a foe, has characterized US policy ever since. Carter may have given the empire a facelift using the discourse of human rights, but policing the world through the pretense of benevolence didn't begin with Carter. In a May 1977 commencement speech, Carter asserted that the United States had a historical birthright to be associated with human rights. And he was indeed correct. Even before World War II and before this idea of human rights carried currency, the US and the West more broadly relied on a discourse of civilization versus barbarity to do good in the world. Before Carter, it was the US President Woodrow Wilson in his war address to Congress on April 2nd of 1917 who spoke of the need for the US to enter the war to make the world safe for democracy. And in 1899, the imperial poet Rudyard Kipling composed his infamous poem about the white man's burden to civilize the world. The poem tells the US to rule over and civilize Cuba and the Philippines after they had resisted the Spanish Empire and forced it to retreat back to Europe. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness, unfluttered folk and wild. Your new-caught, sullen peoples, half devil and half child. In more recent times, only the concepts and language have changed, from civilizing the barbarians to spreading democracy and human rights in the world. Today, the US puts democracy and human rights into the service of empire. It uses them to justify everything from covert operations to invasion and occupation. The 2003 invasion of Iraq, being a notorious example, was sold to the public as a war for democracy. This idealistic branding of imperialism has also been extended to women and LGBTQ rights, which anti-war activists refer to as pinkwashing.
Pinkwashing also, it has a number of tropes, but sort of, they're very recycled. Once you start to see the films and speakers across the board, they're kind of saying the same thing every time. So that's also one way we can discern what is it about. So things that they will say are, Israel is the only safe place for gay people in the Middle East, right? There's often the terrible use of the term Mecca to say it's a gay Mecca. There's often a glamorous painting of the Tel Aviv nightlife as a sort of like gay tourism destination that would be a wonderful place to visit. Just be careful of the scary homophobic Arabs outside of Israel's borders.
The point of this is not to protect LGBT people, right? Like, in reality, there's immense homophobia in Israel and the United States. I mean, I don't know of a country that doesn't have serious problems with homophobia and transphobia. But the point of this is propaganda for Israel to cover over its brutal, brutal apartheid regime.
In previous segments of this program, we spoke about the relationship between the US imperialism and Israeli settler colonialism. This relationship is not limited to arms sale. It is also about a common ideological agenda. Israeli propaganda is especially drenched in a Carter-style imperialism. They shamelessly justify the practices of settler colonialism by restoring to the idea that they are the only democracy in the Middle East, or by showing off women as part of the colonial army, or advocating for gay rights. This is an unfortunate result of Carter's legacy. Although he became critical of Israel in his retirement, his approach to foreign policy prepared the ground for Israeli moral justifications to convince the world that it has the right to dispossess the Palestinians.